Well, I'm sure it's evident to you, as it is to me, that we are living in a culture where the family is under attack. Our society's insatiable appetite for personal gain, self-indulgence, and career-mindedness, this constant promotion of a self-centered ideology is having a devastating effect upon the family unit. It is rather ironic, though, that perhaps the very thing that drives much of our modern society is the pursuit of happiness. But of course, it's a world trying to find a happiness outside of God, divorced from God. This self-orientated pursuit of happiness is leaving the family unit in tatters. And that, of course, leads to deep-seated sadness. I'm personally convinced one of the reasons for the alarming increase of mental health today relates to, very often, family breakdown. Psalm 128 tackles these matters, but from a refreshingly positive perspective. See, the greatest joys in life come from knowing God, pursuing His ways, and living under His blessing. Blessings for you as an individual, your family, and church. And that, in a nutshell, is what Psalm 128 is about. In many ways, Psalm 128 builds off Psalm 127. And we saw that last week. In that psalm, it spoke about the city and the home. Well, Psalm 128 focuses in on the home. It focuses in especially of those living in the homes. It touches on work life. It touches on parenting and children and grandparents even. And it highlights for us where true happiness is found. I'm sure you know what happens when you throw a stone into the middle of a calm pond. You know that scene. You throw that stone out there and plop it goes into that water, that calm water. And then immediately, coming from where that stone has fallen into the water, there is this first little circle, this first little ripple. And then there's a growing one, there's a bigger one outside it. And then, as it were, it goes out further, and then there are bigger ones. Well, we'll see in Psalm 128, 3 spheres of life. We'll move from the inner circle to the outer. You see, the blessings in this passage are traced from the center out. There's a progression here, and there's a connection here between them. It starts with your personal life, it moves out to your family life, and then it moves out to church life. And all 3 of them, I believe, are in Psalm 128. And so our 3 points that we're going to break down the passage and look at it this morning is a holy life, a happy home, and a healthy church. And it breaks open perhaps your translation of the Bible. If you look down at it, perhaps you can see there is some white space between verse 1 and verse 2, and then a bit more white space between verse 4 and verse 5. And so there's these 3 sections, we might say, of this psalm. And so let's look at it then in those ways, in these 3 sections. Firstly, under the first heading, in verse 1, a holy life, where verse 1 says, "Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord." And so here's this statement to begin this little psalm. Oh, how blessed is this person. And what's asserted here is effectively repeated in verse 4, if you'll notice. "Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord." He says, behold. It's like he's pointing his finger, and he's putting his finger on this, and the psalmist is saying, I want you to notice this. I want you to look at this. Don't miss this. Behold. Here's the one who has real prosperity. This is the one who possesses the truest form of happiness. Well, how is this one described? Well, he fears the Lord. Perfectly happy, back in verse 1, perfectly happy is everyone who fears the Lord. Now, how broad is that term? Everyone. Everyone's not limited to one culture. Everyone's not limited to one time. It is about the ancient Hebrews, but it's not just about the ancient Hebrews, it's also about modern Aussies. And so whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, whether you're a grandparent, this is the path of blessing. To fear the Lord. Blessed, he says, is everyone who fears the Lord. And so we're starting with the individual, with the one, every one. Now this concept of the fear of the Lord is, well, it's out of fashion today, isn't it? It's certainly not in within the context of our culture. And it doesn't appear to be in even in the church. I mean, how many Christians are interested to discuss this fear of the Lord? Or want to worship with godly fear? But the Bible's concept of the fear of the Lord is essential if you and I will ever experience the true sense of godly happiness. The scriptural term to fear God is a broad term. It's multifaceted in all of its dimensions, but essentially it speaks about having a right relationship with God from the heart. It speaks about walking before this God. Now, it demands having a right understanding of who God is, and what God is like, that the God of love is also infinitely holy. And he is also just. He's righteous and he's good in all that he does, the absolute sovereign and the coming judge. The fear of the Lord, that expression, that phrase, it's not some exclusive Old Testament concept. No. It's also New Testament language. Like in Hebrews chapter 12, in the last couple of verses of that chapter, we read, serving or worshipping God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. And so there we're told that we cannot actually serve God acceptably. We cannot actually worship God acceptably, that is, in a way that he will accept, unless there is this quality of reverence and godly fear. And he even gives us reasons why there should be godly fear, why there should be this sense of awe and reverence in that verse. In Hebrews 12, verse 29, it says at the end, why? For our God is a consuming fire. Not he was a consuming fire in the Old Testament, and now that Jesus has come, it's all but love. No, he says our God is a consuming fire. Fearing God, you see, invokes true worship, acceptable worship to God. The God-fearer serves. The God-fearer obeys God personally in his or her everyday life. It is in that sense a constant awareness that I live every moment in my life under the eye and in the presence of the living God. That this is the one with whom I must give account. There's a fear of offending him, absolutely, but there's also a desire that I want to please him. Now, we need to understand that this is not a slavish fear, like you might see a dog cringing before a cruel master, and that dog's worried that, oh no, I'm going to get hit with a stick again. No, the fear of God spoken of here is healthy. It's more like a child that a child would feel toward a caring parent who he or she honors. It's rather the fear to offend the one who has rescued me from destruction. It's a fear to act in a way that is unworthy of the great kindness that he has shown to me, like he has forgiven all my sins. It's a fear lest we ever forget His goodness toward us. You see, it is only those who are truly God's children, who are right with Him through His Son Jesus Christ, who possess this fear. You see, if you have never gone to Jesus Christ for salvation, you are not in God's family. You're not His child. If you have never gone to God to have dealings over your own personal sins, you're not in a relationship with Him. Psalm 144 and verse 15 says, "Happy are the people whose God is the Lord." You will never know true happiness until God is your Lord. And so here is the most fundamental point. There can never be a happy life. There can never be a truly happy home unless the members of that home are in a right relationship with the living God from the heart through Jesus Christ. There must be the personal fear of God. What we each need most is, put it really simply, we need the Lord. As men, husbands and fathers, we must fear God. Ladies, mothers, grandmothers, singles, marrieds need to fear the Lord. Teenagers, older children, younger children, all need to fear the Lord. Everyone. We need to know the Lord of the Bible, and we need to have a right reverence of Him and be in a right relationship with Him. It is to know Him, and it is to walk with Him. Blessed, that is, perfectly happy, is everyone who fears the Lord. That's the greatest thing needed, and it's maybe one of the greatest things lacking today. Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 3, there is none who have the fear of God before their eyes. Strangely, it's lacking with many who profess Christ. Oddly, we should think this is very odd, that it's lacking in many churches. That sense of awe is missing. It is only when individual members in the church of Christ are walking in godly fear that a church can ever be healthy. It all boils down to this. It all boils down to this. Do you fear the Lord? Is that how you live? Those of you who are single and you desire one day to marry, let me just give a word of encouragement to you. This is the type of spouse you ought to choose. I know outward beauty might turn your head, but God puts the emphasis here. So I encourage you to choose someone who fears the Lord, otherwise you will never have a happy life. You won't have a happy home. Better off to stay single. You say, well, how do I know if someone is fearing God? Well, I think verse 1, we see the proof of being a God-fearer. If we just go back quickly to verse 1, it says, Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in His ways. Here's what goes together. The fear of God in the inner man and obedience to God in the outer man. And you know what God does? God has done something wonderful. He has put holiness and happiness together. They're like best friends. These two, holiness and happiness, are never apart. They always walk together. Holiness and happiness, they go together. And that's why true pursuing happiness without God is truly pointless. When I was a young fella in early primary school, I had a good friend. Harry Hines was his name. We'd go everywhere together when we were at school, at primary school, arm in arm, during little lunch, as we used to call it, and big lunch. We were never apart. We were best friends, just like holiness and happiness. So, fruit of the one who fears God is a life of obedience to God. That's the only life where true happiness is found. Holiness and happiness are never apart. Friends, that's the case for the individual, and it's also true for the family. So let's move secondly into the second point that we see as the passage develops. Secondly, a happy home. And here the psalmist takes us into this house, and effectively he introduces us to the family members. See who he first introduces us to. Let's look back at the passage here. In verse 2 it says, "When you eat the labor of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine." And so obviously, as we see the connection, the way that he goes on and speaks about verse 3 there, who is he introducing us to in the first place? He speaks about the man of the house, the husband as it were in this situation, the father in this particular family, the guy who's been at work all day. Now, in that agrarian society, he's laboured probably out in the field, and at the end of the day, when he's finished out there in the paddock, he returns to the family. And here we see him sitting there at the table, and he's eating. He's enjoying the labour of his hands. And did you notice? He's happy. Verse 2, "When you eat the labour of your hands, you shall be happy, and it shall be well with you." That man hasn't been idle all day. He hasn't been scratching around, basically wasting his time on the internet and doing nothing. He hasn't stayed in bed all day. He hasn't just played games all day. He has laboured in his calling. Hard work is a virtue. It's part of practical holiness. Idleness is a vice. Next we see the wife or mother. Verse 3 again, let's just look at it more closely now. "Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house." Your wife shall be like, she's likened to a fruitful vine. It was common back then, apparently, to train a vine to grow alongside the sides of the house. And that would be a place, if you think about it, that would be giving you easy access to the produce that would grow on that vine. Refreshing fruits there would be available easily, beneficial for the entire family. And though the vine was weak, the vine was a tender plant, it needed support, it needed to be cherished, and yet it was very valuable. Another thing to think about was that many of these houses of the East were often so designed that they had an open court in the center, and they had rooms around the outsides. And so perhaps we're meant to see that this fruitful vine is growing on the walls in that central courtyard. I say that because of what verse 3 says. "Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house." And so the vine, in its beauty, in its delicateness, in its prosperity, is a wonderful picture of a godly mother in the home. Now the Apostle Peter, remember, we know enough about him to know he was a married man, he had a mother, and he had a mother-in-law. He knew about women. How did he describe his wife? Well, let's turn to 1 Peter. Let's turn over in our Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3. And in this passage where he is directly giving a word to husbands, yet indirectly we see what he says in relation about the wife. What does he say about the wife in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7? "Husbands, likewise, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, Peter isn't being derogatory here. I remind you, friends, these are God's words. The godly wife, thinking of Psalm 128, she's like an ancient vine. It's tender. She needs to be supported. She needs to be cherished by her husband. And so Peter rightly is bringing this exhortation to we who are husbands, that it is our duty to be gentle to our wives. It is our duty before God, if we're to be a godly husband, that we are to be understanding of our wives and to recognize that she's not a man, she's not a brute like you might be, she is of the weaker sex, she is a weaker vessel, using Peter's expression, and so she is to be treated that way. Not so will bring real hindrance. It will bring hindrance to your marriage. It will bring hindrance even to you spiritually as a couple. And so coming back to this scene of the wife, she's likened to this tender vine. The godly woman in the home brings a unique beauty. We might say she sends a sweet fragrance there in the center that goes through the entire family. She's a fruitful vine. And like a vine laden with clusters of fruit, the godly woman is fruitful in many ways. She brings love into the heart of that family. She brings faithfulness. She brings gentleness. She brings kindness. She brings all those aspects of the fruit of the Spirit if she's a godly woman. Yet Psalm 128 mentions, it seems, in this context of this verse, her fruitfulness also in relation to children. It seems to be the primary thing in mind. She teaches the children. She cares for them. She corrects them. She loves them. She helps them in their schooling. She prays for them. She prays with them. She gives them a godly example. And I want to underscore, where does the psalmist show us she is? Where is she? Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the very heart of the house, your house. In the God-fearing family described here, the father works outside the home, the mother works inside the home. It reflects what we find right at the very outset of the human race, as is stated in the opening pages of our Bibles. I'm referring to Genesis chapter 3. When the curse was announced, it impacted the man in the realm of his labor, and it impacted the woman in the realm of her labor. Remember? He would labor in sweat out with the weeds, and she would be in sorrow with childbirth. And that sets up the overall pattern at the very beginning of the human race, be it a fallen race, and yet we still see this pattern. The man labored outside the home and the mother inside. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in Titus chapter 2 help confirm this in the New Testament. And there in that passage, especially in Titus chapter 2, the godly older women in the local church there in the island of Crete, they are to help the younger women know how to be godly women. And specifically it says that they are to bring their teaching of practical advice and instruction and help and encouragement and counsel what to do. To help them to know how to love their husbands, how to love their children, how to be pure. And then it says how to be homemakers, how to be managers, how to be workers at home. And then the passage goes on to say not to do so will bring blasphemy on God's word. Now sometimes there are exceptional circumstances that necessitate a young mother to get work outside the home. But friends, we have no grounds to make the exception into a rule. And though our world today sounds loudly the message of egalitarian relationships, this equality, the equal rights of women, and women might say, well, I'm a woman. I'm just as much entitled to my career. Yeah, I'm married, now I'm having babies, but why should having babies, why should that interfere with my career as a dentist? Our culture is not godly. Our culture is incessantly pressurizing mothers to go back to work. That is in particular what I'm saying, working outside the home. But the godly woman knows her calling. Her calling comes from God. And she delights to do good. In the words of Proverbs 31, she delights to do good to her husband, and she delights to do it in the very heart of the house. As Christians committed to walking in God's way with the fear of God in our hearts, we need to plug our ears to the deafening propaganda of the world and its worldly philosophies. True happiness, I remind you, is only found in God's holy ways. As we look around the home here back in Psalm 128, we're also introduced not just to the father, not just to the mother, but we now see the children. Look at this. It's wonderful, really. As the passage goes on to say, second half of verse 3, your children like olive plants all around your table. Well, that's a lovely scene, isn't it? It's actually, I would suggest, a picture of harmony. Children all around the family table. Dad is at the head, mum's caring, and the kids are around the table. They're seated. Now, I've been a dad. I'm a granddad. That doesn't just happen. Children all seated quiet and still at the family table. Not a rabble, but there's actually order. See, there's some things implied with this little scene. This implies parental control. There is loving control in this home. There is respect. There is loving discipline and submission. Otherwise, this thing would never have occurred. I think it is interesting that the olive tree is used here in the comparison. That the olive tree, you know how that olive branch, it's been actually for millennia, it's been the symbol for peace. Way back in the Egyptian Empire, the Greeks, the Romans, they all used the olive branch as a symbol for peace. And of course it goes further back than that, doesn't it? It goes all the way back to the ark and Noah sending out the dove and the dove coming back. And what did the dove have in its mouth? It had an olive leaf. It's a symbol of peace. And so I suggest to you, this is a harmonious home. How do you have a harmonious home? Well, it must spring from a marriage of harmony. It must be from the fact that this is a godly man and a godly woman pursuing the roles and the functions within their relationship toward one another that God has given. What I'm saying is the man is actually leading. The wife's not dominating, the wife's not nagging, the wife's not having the last say, because such thing would lead to the children being taught how to rebel. And in the end, that would not be a happy marriage. In the end, that is not going to be a happy home. And so here are the children. They're likened to olive plants, or in the Hebrew, it could be olive shoots. Young olive plants popping up around the base of this old olive tree. And at the foot of the tree, you see it. See that picture in your mind? Are these little sprouting plants. They're growing. They're only little, but they are developing. They are maturing. It's happening slowly. These little saplings, they're full of promise, aren't they? They're full of life, and they're growing under the shade and the protection of the parent tree. It's a great image. You see how this image communicates the blessing of children growing up and being nurtured in a godly home. The godly home is where parents are seeking by God's grace to raise their children in the fear and the admonition of the Lord and raising them in a well-rounded development. Now maybe you're listening to this morning and you think, well, this is not relevant for me. I'm not married. I'm a single. Don't have kids. Or maybe your family, the children aren't like this anymore. They're no longer around the table. They've flown the nest. They've flown the coop. You're an empty nester. This is relevant for you. This shows how you as a Christian must pray for Christian parents who are in this stage of life. You are to look for ways, I would say, to encourage them in a very difficult task. Pray for those in your own family who are in this stage. Pray for those who are in your church family, that God would bless that training of those Christian parents unto the salvation of the souls of those little children that we spoke of last week. And so we've seen holy life, a happy home. Now thirdly and finally, a healthy church. And I remind you that this psalm is one of the songs of ascent. It's sung by pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for corporate worship. This song was not sung by a hermit. This song was not sung by an insular family that is withdrawn from others, that is focused on self and in isolation and likes to stay away. This man, this family, has a clear attachment to the people of God. Verse 5. The Lord bless you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Here is this anticipation that the blessing of God is going to flow to him and flow to his family from where? Out of Zion. Zion, we might call it, the old covenant church. Here's a man whose heart is beating to see the flourishing of God's people in faith and love and obedience. He wants to see God's Zion flourish all the days of his life. You see, that's what he says. He's not after just, a brief season of blessing. That was nice. He wants to be part of it. Or may you see the God of the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. He wants this blessing to be personal for this man and his family. Oh, that you would be part of this. Oh, that you would enjoy this and be enriched by this. That you would receive these things yourself. And so here we see the God-fearing person. Here we see the godly family committed to God's covenant community. And of course, in today's language, the new covenant Zion is the local church. That's where those blessings flow in this world now in the context of the new covenant. He hasn't set up anything else. And look, according to his scriptures, he set up the local church as the institution, as the very organism, as the very precious gift out of which, that's the Zion, out of which the blessings flow. You see, this man doesn't just go to church. His concern is far deeper. He wants to be part of all of this. He wants to be part of God's Zion. He wants to be in the stated meetings in God's house. He is desirous to contribute to God's work and not just to take from it. The godly family prays for and labors for the prosperity of Zion all the days of his life. He doesn't run away when things get difficult and enjoy his isolation. He knows Zion is the place of special blessing. He knows that there are special blessings attached and associated with Zion that are not found anywhere else, because that is where God manifests himself in a special way. Back in those days, that's where the old covenant ministers would teach God's word. That's where God's people would gather for prayer at the hour of incense, morning and evening. That's where they could go to meet God, to worship God, to give to God, to find and enjoy fellowship, not just with God, but with God's people. That's where there were true blessings. The Lord bless you out of Zion, and may you see the good of Jerusalem all the days of your life. What a wonderful scene this psalm finishes with. God's church prosperous all his days. There is something here in this psalm for everyone, even grandparents. Because the godly man lives to see not only his children, but his children's children, and that they too would receive the great blessings of a flourishing church. That's verse 6. Yes, there's an affirmation. Yes, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. Shalom. He wants his grandchildren to experience shalom, that Hebrew concept, that rich peace, that spiritual prosperity, that blessing in Zion. He wants his grandchildren to know it and to experience it. In this psalm we find a holy life, a happy home, and a healthy church, and each are connected to the other, and from one flows out into the other. Right from the very beginning, happiness flows from the spring out of it all. A personal relationship with God, walking with God. Happiness is found in the man providing for his family. It's found in his wife and her fulfilling her God-given calling. Happiness comes in the development of those children in the ways of God, in a rightly ordered home, in a harmonious home, in a God-blessed marriage and God-blessed parenting and God-blessed relationships between siblings. They're harmonious. They're not fighting against one another. There is peace in that place. Happiness is discovered as the family labors together for the good and the advancement of God's Zion. They don't leave it to somebody else. Just leave it to that other family. They always turn up. Friends, there can never be a healthy local church without committed core families walking in God-fearing ways. And so, my brothers and sisters in Christ, settle for nothing less than seeking to rear this kind of family that's portrayed here in Psalm 128. Settle for nothing less as an individual for being the one mentioned in this psalm. Wherever this psalm finds you in life, whether you're a single, whether you're a parent, whether you're a grandie, settle for anything short of this and you are accepting second best, and you're robbing yourself and your family of true happiness. We should set our sights on the standards that God gives. And by God's grace, they can be realized. These are realistic, even for stumbling sinners like you and I. God's grace is sufficient. Our hope is not in ourselves. It's not in a family heritage or anything. Maybe in your case, it's like, well, you're the generation where you can draw the line, and we're not doing that. We're now going to do this. Our hope is in the Lord alone. It's to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, that we look. Whoever would look to him as those who are trusting him, remember, my brother and sister, that he ever lives to make intercession for us. And so we need to look to him for fresh measures of his grace and his Spirit, even crying out to him to raise up godly families in our day and to bless our younger married couples with children, to bless them in that parenting role. Surely it's desperately needed. May God multiply. May he multiply. Psalm 128 type God-fearers. May he be pleased to grant many happy homes to the Berean church and right across our nation. And it all starts in verse 1. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord and walks in his way. Let's pray.